Okay, so today we're going to talk about the structures within the lungs. We left off yesterday talking about the lungs themselves and mostly about those membranes around the lungs, the visceral, uh, what's called the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, and those things are the membranes that come together that lubricate. So when the lungs expand and move a little bit, there's no friction. And we talked about how if there's an adhesion and they try to expand, that catches and can cause some discomfort called pleurisy. Anyway, now moving on to the primary bronchi, and you should be probably looking at a diagram like the one on page 388. Now that's a kind of an interior view, um, anterior and superior. So you're looking at it from the top, this particular diagram. Okay, and that I think will help you to identify some of those pieces, some of those structures. So the medial depression of the lungs is called the hilus, and so I think all of that stuff is shown in that diagram. But kind of if this was the shape of the lung, where that tube comes into there is the hilus. They continue to divide into smaller and smaller bronchi. So you'd have primary bronchi, and then those branch into secondary bronchi, and then those branch into more branches, which are called tertiary, and you could have quaternary branches and so on. And eventually they form what are called bronchioles, which are the kind of smallest branches. So it goes trachea, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary, and then bronchioles eventually, the smallest branches. And then, as we discussed yesterday, eventually those enter those little tiny sacs. But that network of branches is called the bronchial tree. And actually, the video that we watched yesterday pointed some of that out, the bronchial tree. The terminal bronchioles lead to the respiratory zone where actual gas exchange takes place. So the air to this point has entered the nose and trachea and primary bronchi and secondary, tertiary bronchioles. So now it's gone from what we would call pulmonary ventilation coming in to now we're getting down to what's called external respiration. And external respiration means exchange of gases with the air from the outside. If I click ahead too fast in these, you can just pause it. But otherwise, I'm gonna go ahead and go. If you need to pause it or drag it back a little bit, if I've advanced the slides too quickly, you're welcome to do that. So that respiratory zone, what makes up the area where the exchange of gases occurs? Well, the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and what are called the alveoli. And let me go back on that. Then you should be looking at page 389. That branching is shown on page 389. So as we're talking about this, it's really helpful, guys. I know I'm always badgering you about having your book open, but it really is helpful when we talk about these things to be able to put what we're talking about and have a visual there. So I would really strongly encourage you to do that. Excuse me. So you see there the terminal bronchiole, and the term terminal means end. So that's where the branching has kind of stopped. And then we have respiratory bronchioles, and those have the alveolar sacs on them. And the thing that connects those alveolar sacs is called the alveolar duct. So there's a nice close-up of that right here on page 389. Those alveolar ducts, just branches, and thus the name using the term tree or branching. So then, in this, the video pointed out also the respiratory membrane. There has to be an actual sharing of a membrane. So these things, there has to be a passing. And if you'll remember, what was critical about that membrane? The video pointed out the difference in things like fish and us. Well, in fish, they're in water, so everything's wet. So the gases are dissolved in water already. In our case, we're breathing in what's primarily dry air. And so the moisture that's necessary has to be a wet membrane for that exchange to occur. Those gases have to be dissolved in a liquid. So it's a wet membrane, that respiratory membrane. The alveoli are composed of a single layer of thin, squamous epithelial cells. It's important that it's a single layer because if it were multiple layers, the gas would have to exchange into the first one and then into the second one and then into the third one and so on. And it would just be too complex and too cumbersome to be efficient as far as the exchange of gases. It's important that it's a singular layer. And if you remember, epithelial cells are for lining, which would make sense here. It's the lining of the alveoli. And then squamous means that they're just like squashed. They're flat, irregularly shaped, but basically flat. The alveolar pores connect neighboring sacs, and that's what I was just showing you when I held the book up, and you obviously got that same picture. But the pores, actually, I need to show you that again, maybe. It does show them, but I don't know if I showed it to you adequately. What it's saying there is, in this diagram, if we look really closely, there are these little dots on there. And so if these are two separate alveoli, there actually can be an opening where those two things can share, or air or gases can move between those two sacs. So the pores connect neighboring air sacs. So it would be like a bunch of grapes. That's how the alveoli are usually described, as a bunch of grapes, but it would be like the grapes are partially kind of stuck together. They're not all completely independent. There's some interconnectedness, and that's by way of these alveolar pores. The external surface of the alveoli are covered with a network of pulmonary capillaries. So if this is that bulb that's an alveolar sac, there's this whole web of pulmonary capillaries. And if you remember, pulmonary always refers to the lungs. We're talking about lung capillaries. And from last chapter, we just talked about this yesterday also, that the blood that's coming to there would be coming via the pulmonary arteries, which are carrying deoxygenated blood, which can be confusing because they're arteries, but pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood. Then it branches, that pulmonary artery branches into these thin capillaries, these very fine capillaries that surround each of those alveolar sacs. And so that's where the actual gas exchange occurs. And then if we were to switch it around, now on the other side of those capillaries, after they've been oxygenated and and the blood has unloaded its carbon dioxide, now the branches go the other way, come back together to make venules and veins, and eventually the pulmonary veins, which return the blood to the left side of the heart to be pumped out to the rest of the body. The alveolar membrane and the capillary membrane and their fused basement membrane equal the respiratory membrane. So these things need to be side by side. And that is shown on page 390. And I would encourage you to look at this inset. And on that inset, you can see on this side is the capillary, and then we have the membrane in between, and then we have the alveolar side on this side. So as you might imagine, on the alveolar side, there is a greater percentage of oxygen, so it's moving into the blood. And on the capillary side, there's a greater percentage, or a higher amount, I should say, of carbon dioxide, so it's going to move across the membrane in the other direction. The lungs have 70 to 80 square meters. I think the video we watched actually said close to 100 square meters, and there would be some variation. You can imagine that in body size, someone who's much larger and has a much larger thoracic cage is going to have bigger lungs that have more surface area. But the critical part for you to understand about that is that surface area is the key. I mean, all that oxygen that's in your lungs doesn't really do any good unless it's touching one of those surfaces. So, I mean, the oxygen that's back away from the surface of the membrane doesn't get exchanged, or it's not efficient for its exchange. So it's important that it branches into these very tiny bulbs or alveolar sacs so that as much as possible, the gases can touch the membrane and actually get exchanged. Excuse me. Air flows on one side, blood flows on the other side, and gas exchange occurs by diffusion. So oxygen goes from the high side on the alveolar side into the low side, which is on the deoxygenated blood returning from your body. Carbon dioxide goes from what was the deoxygenated blood, or blood returning from your system. Cellular respiration produces a great deal of carbon dioxide. You're unloading that from the blood side into the alveolar side. Other parts include macrophages, and the video again yesterday did a good job of showing how those kind of move along into that alveolar opening and move along into the next alveolar opening, and their job is to engulf debris, to get rid of whatever's gotten past the other filtering systems. Those other filtering systems primarily include the hairs in your nose and the mucus that lines the entire respiratory tract. And so all of you have probably done some sort of dirty job. You know, if you've ever cleaned out a grain bin, or even mowed the lawn on a dry, dusty day or whatever, you end up doing a lot of coughing or sneezing or blowing your nose, and it might not be that nice to think about, but there's a lot of dirt in that, and that dirt got caught up in the mucous membranes of your respiratory system before it got completely into your lungs. Macrophages are able to destroy some of the things that may get all the way into your lungs. Cuboidal cells secrete surfactant, and the critical part of that is it says it decreases the surface tension of the water layer in the lungs. So what you don't want to have is this wall of the alveoli. If it adhered to itself, then it's not going to fill up with air. So there's this surfactant lining it to keep it from kind of sticking to itself, keeps it open. So you have a moist membrane, but it doesn't stick to itself. It doesn't collapse and stick to itself. Okay, this part I'm going to go through very quickly because we already talked about these first few slides. So the 4 events are pulmonary ventilation. That means the movement of air in and out of your lungs, of which the N part is inspiration, created by the muscles of your rib cage and diaphragm expanding the rib cage and causing air to be pushed into your lungs. Expiration, just the opposite. The elasticity of your lungs and the relaxation of your diaphragm causes expiration passively. Forced expiration, that's what I was explaining to you with blowing out the last candle on your birthday cake. You feel it in your abs and also in your ribs. And so that's for forced expiration. And this, we can skip through all of this. You already have all these notes. So there's that diagram again. There are really two parts of this that are critical. Number one is this part, which is the tidal volume. That's what you would normally use. And the second part is the vital capacity, which is all you can use. Okay, so this again is tidal, and this is vital. Tidal and vital. Those are the two that really matter. This part down here, residual, doesn't really make that much difference because you can't make use of it anyway. Okay, and that shows those volumes. You just wrote those down yesterday, so you don't need to do anything with that. And then dead space, again, is created by the fact that from here to here, from where the air enters your body until it goes actually into the lungs where gas exchange can occur, that's dead space. So when you blow out, you end up exhaling air that's used or low in oxygen, but you keep this much air that's already been used and breathe it back in because you can't get all of that out. Talked about these, coughing, sneezing, hiccups. External respiration is what we talked about yesterday with regards to exchange. It's the same thing that happens. Well, it's this right here. It's this exchange across that fused respiratory membrane that's made up of the alveolar membrane and the capillary membrane. Gas transport is just the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. Carbon dioxide gets carried mostly in the plasma. Most of the oxygen gets carried in the red blood cells as part of attached to hemoglobin. Internal respiration now is very similar to this, except now we're talking about the tissue side and the blood side instead of the alveolar side and the blood side. So it's the same kind of exchange, but it's occurring out at the tissues. So now we're on to some new material again. How do we regulate our respiration? What are the factors that affect our breathing, our exchange of gases? Muscles are stimulated by the phrenic and intercostal nerves, the interaction of the medulla and the pons. So those are parts of your brain that we just studied 2 or 3 chapters ago, but that's where some of those involuntary actions occur. Now, our breathing is one of those things that's kind of unique in that we can control it, but it has a normal rhythm without us controlling it. So it's involuntary. Basically, what we would say is, the tidal volume, doing that is basically involuntary. But if we want to blow out more, want to breathe in more, we can do that, and we can hold our breath and all those kinds of things. But that normal kind of rate of breathing would be set by the medulla or pons in an involuntary way. Normal respiration, about 12 to 15 breaths per minute. So you're talking about a breath every 4 or 5 seconds. And we'll try to look at some of that stuff with what we call a respiration belt to measure some of that. But it's very difficult, kind of like it was when we were using the lung volume bag to measure your lung capacities. It's kind of hard to do things normally when you're conscious of it. But it'll give you an idea. Stretch receptors in the bronchioles and the alveoli initiate expiration when the lungs become overinflated. So the fact that they stretch, causes the diaphragm then to relax and allows them to collapse. Collapse isn't a great word when we're talking about lungs, but to contract. And so that the stretching is what creates that. Suppression of the medulla will stop respiration. And so anything that causes the medulla to not function properly will keep you from breathing, will actually cause you to stop breathing. Rate and depth of respiration is modified by physical factors. Those factors and also by conscious effort. If you wait, is that okay?
Yeah.
I'll be about 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so physical factors, like running. I mean, when you're doing your track workout or whatever, you're going to breathe at a different depth and rate than you would when you're sitting here watching this lecture. Conscious effort, but that's limited by the medulla. When the O2 levels become too low, if you hold your breath too long, you're gonna probably, you might pass out. Then you're going to resume breathing because that's a self-preservation. And then emotional factors, and probably all of us have been nervous, maybe speaking in front of people or something like that, and you get short of breath and you have to talk in really short little bits, and it's not that pleasant, but it does happen, and it's probably happened to all of us. And then there are chemical factors that affect respiration as well. Chemical factors are the most significant. What's the feedback that your body is giving with regard to your breathing? Homeostasis is the result, of negative feedback involving chemoreceptors for carbon dioxide and oxygen. And this is kind of a unique thing, and we'll talk a little bit about why it can be dangerous to be on oxygen. It's vital to be on oxygen. For example, if you have COPD, you need some additional oxygen, but it has to be properly regulated, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. I'll let you finish writing that. Excuse me. We're on page 399. There's actually a good summary on page 397 of how breathing is controlled. Kind of shows a bit of a diagram tying all those factors together and the control mechanisms. Okay, so carbon dioxide combines with water to make, see if I can find you that equation. I don't know if I can find that exact equation. But at any rate, and it ends up creating hydrogen and bicarbonate ion. And so it's carbon dioxide and water make carbonic acid, which then can become hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So an increase in carbon dioxide will cause the blood to become acidic. And what it's talking about is this is carbonic acid. Okay, so if there's too much carbon dioxide, it's going to create carbonic acid, and that's going to make the blood become alkaline. Excuse me, I said that. This is going to cause it to become acidic. Okay, low pH because of this acid. Okay. A decrease in carbon dioxide, on the other hand, will cause blood to become alkaline. And alkaline is just another term for basic. And so alkaline means high pH. And that's called respiratory alkalosis. So too much carbon dioxide or a high level of carbon dioxide makes the blood acidic, respiratory acidosis. Low amounts of carbon dioxide causes it to become alkaline or basic. So if you don't have this, if you don't have carbon dioxide, you're not making carbonic acid, and so it would become basic. Okay, I'll leave this on for a while. But hypoventilation means low ventilation. Really, you're not getting much air out of you're not getting much air out of your lungs, and that can result in respiratory acidosis. Slow and shallow. Fast and deep. Maybe you've heard of somebody hyperventilating, but that's fast, deep breathing, and that can cause high acidity. There's no opportunity. In this case, there's no opportunity to build up the carbon dioxide that's in the blood, and we'll talk about that down at the bottom bullet there. But both alter the buffering ability of blood. And buffering, if you don't remember that from chemistry, is having something of a kind of a weak nature to keep the pH from swinging wildly up and down. That's what we mean by buffering, keeping it from swinging up and down. In addition to hyperventilation, hyperventilation will produce apnea or cessation of breathing, which will produce cyanosis or change in color. You probably know somebody that has sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is one of the common things that's treated with a CPAP machine, with a breathing mask. Some of you may know somebody that wears a breathing mask. Probably all of us know somebody that wears a breathing mask, but primarily that's used to treat apnea. Stopping hyperventilating is done with breathing into a bag. And so what you're doing is you're rebreathing the carbon dioxide in the exhaled air, and that changes the diffusion gradient so that the CO2 is not unloaded. Okay, so I don't know, something happened there. Sorry, guys. Hopefully you were seeing the right thing. But let's get back into presentation here. So unloaded into the alveolar air. Change the diffusion gradient. And so what we're saying is it's going to keep more if the CO2 is not unloaded into the alveolar air. So this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but I think it will if I explain it a little bit. And that is, okay, in your lungs, your blood, if you're hyperventilating, it causes your blood to be too basic. In other words, it doesn't have enough carbon dioxide that's creating enough carbonic acid. So what you do by breathing into a bag is now you're rebreathing the carbon dioxide. Now the carbon dioxide starts to build up in your lungs. So now there's more in your lungs than there is on the blood side, on the capillary side. And so now carbon dioxide, instead of doing its normal direction of going from the blood into your lungs, it goes from your lungs into your blood and creates more carbonic acid and raises the pH. So it takes you from having, try that again. It takes you from having alkalosis, because you don't have enough carbon dioxide and therefore enough carbonic acid and therefore a low enough pH, to moving you toward acidosis. But really what you want to be is something in the middle. You don't want to have the extreme in either direction. Chemical regulation further, the rate and depth are increased by an increase in carbon dioxide concentration. And you can think about that logically. when your body, when you're working out, you're producing in your tissues a lot of carbon dioxide. And so if you have high concentrations of carbon dioxide, it's going to cause you to breathe more rapidly and more deeply in an attempt to try to get rid of that carbon dioxide. That acts on the medulla. Carbon dioxide gets removed and the rate and depth return to normal. However, that doesn't happen right away. Just like your heart rate doesn't return to normal right after you finish exerting yourself, you continue to breathe deeply for a while too. I'll leave that up there for just a touch more. I might have been a little quick there. Again, if you have to stop, just stop the lecture and then restart it when you're caught up. Okay. Secondly, okay, one too far. Okay, I'm going to give you some time there to write, and then I'll return and talk to you a little bit more about that. Okay, so these are in order. Number one was increased carbon dioxide. That's the number one way that your body uses to regulate breathing. But then there's also a decrease in O2 concentration, and that also acts on the medulla. Increased ventilation, in other words, if you're moving more air in and out of your lungs, you're going to increase the oxygen level. That first asterisk is really important. In a healthy person, respiration is regulated by carbon dioxide concentration. Okay? It's regulated by how much carbon dioxide your body is producing and you have to get rid of, rather than by how much oxygen you're taking in. In a person with chronic lung disease like COPD, emphysema, carbon dioxide is retained and the brain accommodates or gets used to high levels of carbon dioxide. So because they can't squeeze all the air out of their lungs and therefore can't expand and take in enough volume of air, in other words, there's decreased ventilation rather than increased ventilation. It accommodates or gets used to those carbon dioxide, those high levels of carbon dioxide. So then it responds instead to oxygen concentration. Okay, I'm going to read you this passage from your book. It says that we're in response to this, your body adjusting to high levels of carbon dioxide and therefore responding to oxygen. This is an interesting fact because it explains why patients of emphysema are always given low levels of oxygen. If they were given high levels, they would stop breathing because their respiratory stimulus, which is now low oxygen levels, would be gone. So in other words, these things in your lungs, this is responding to things in your lungs. If you have high oxygen, then it's going to actually feed back that you don't need any oxygen, and it could cause cessation of breathing. It's actually in the blood, and it says chemoreceptors in the aortic arch and the carotid arteries. So if the oxygen levels in your blood get too high, then it could feed back that you don't need to breathe. Okay, so that's what we're saying here. High levels of oxygen could potentially kill these patients because that oxygen saturation in the blood would